soybean yields. Right.
Okay, I've just shared my screen. If you can't see that, please let me know. First of all, Kurt, thank you, and thanks to all on the committee for inviting me again. I always enjoy this conference. One thing I always look forward to it. And I commend you for what seems to be something that's working very well. I participated all day yesterday, and I enjoyed it. So, yeah, position, grow, protect. We're going to talk about some strategies and tactics for maximizing double crop soybean yields. You may have heard this presentation before. This is a subject I'm actually very passionate about, largely because I've worked on it for over 20 years here at Tech. And it's a system that used to be our bread and butter. And I'd like to take it back to that. So anyway, let's go ahead and begin. I've used this quote over and over again. Agriculture will come into its own when her fields are green in the winter. That was somewhat prophesized over 100 years ago. Now, many cover crop advocates are using this now, and for good reason. I think this is the key to getting us to that next level. Once we keep the fields green in the wintertime and in the summer, keep something growing all the time, we will move to that next highest level of yield and environmental quality and everything. However, I advocate not necessarily cover crops, but let's grow 2 crops a year, whether that's wheat, barley, or maybe another crop such as rapeseed that we're growing some of now. I'm all for it because cover crops just don't feed the world. Now, let me qualify that. If you're growing a cover crop and you're grazing that land or making hay off of it, then that's part of the system. Matter of fact, that may even be a more, I guess, sustainable might be a good word if you're grazing that and then growing the next crop. So don't get me wrong on this, but I really think if we're just using it for cover crops, we're missing out on something. So I'd really like to see, our fields green with a actual, in our case, grain crop. So let's talk about this double crop small grain soybean system. Lots of good reasons to do this. Environmentally sound, again, we can help feed the world. We're producing more. There are some efficiency gains. We definitely have higher soybean quality. And I think with certain techniques I'll talk about today, we can have higher small grain quality. Now, greater income for all, that's something that is true. I mean, we're spending more money, so that not only helps it's a greater gross income for the farmer. Sometimes today, many farmers are questioning whether the net income's greater. But we build that agricultural industry. And I think in general, I think all of us would like to see this system work. One thing I want you to remember before we go any farther, we really cannot treat those double crop soybeans like we treat full season beans. You must remember that. If we do that, we're probably going to fail with soybean, or worse yet, just use it as a second crop. I see a lot of that in the Midwest where they're trying double crop systems. Well, they planted wheat. Yeah, let's put in soybeans, see what it does. We can't do that. Now, I mentioned greater income for all, but quite honestly, that net income to the farmer has been shrinking, largely due to our wheat crop. In most cases, I hear from a lot of farmers, our wheat yields just aren't keeping up. And then we've had we've had wet springs lately. We've had some fusarium head blight problems. We've had disease problems, test weight problems, over many of the years. So we've seen that dollar shrink. So what that's resulted in is decline in acres of our double crop. Now this is a 6-state summary of over the last 30 years of our soybean acres, which has gone up. Small grain acres have gone down, and now, just in this past year, we were only 25% of our soybean acres were double crop. I've actually, in Virginia, I've actually seen it as high as 60% on certain years, and I think we have throughout the Delmarva. Now I'm going to focus largely on soybean here, but I'm going to also say something about wheat. So let's move on from there. Yield is king. I don't think any of us will deny that. Soybean and the small grain crop. So I always remind people, can we save a little money, but let's make sure we keep that yield up, and you'll see that as we go through my presentation. Even though I'm not going to talk about soybean, continue to use those practices and inputs in small grain that will maintain or increase the wheat yield and its profitability. We've had great strides in small grain production since, I would say since, the 80s, but we need to keep that moving. All right. Graph I've shown over and over again. This is a graph of planting date and yield potential. Now this is percent of maximum yield, 100%. And I've got an NC State photograph here because this is a graph that Jim Dunphy of NC State showed me nearly 25 years ago. He said this will explain, over half of soybean production. And I won't get into why that is the case. But basically, you see our yield gradually decline until some date, and that's usually about mid-June in Virginia. Could go a little bit farther out as we move farther north, and then we just get that rapid drop off in yield due to planting dates. Several reasons for that, but largely it's we don't have enough leaf area. That's what LAI is, leaf area index. That's where I came into play. Jim just said if we can get them tall enough and lapped enough by flowering, we'll be okay. I say no, we need 4 layers of leaves. We need 4 acres of leaves for every acre of ground by that time. And we've even come a little farther in understanding that now, which I'll get into. Long story short, I want this, what you're seeing on the top 2 photographs, and not this. In all cases here, these soybean are at the flowering stage. We're at R2, beginning to form pods. Wide rows, this is probably a year we didn't get a lot of growth. This is actually the same field. These 2 pictures on the right. This is under one of our better river bottom soils, but like most river bottom land, you get into sands, and that's that lower picture. So in other words, this is what we're trying to gain. Now, so take home message. If you don't remember anything else, remember this: position, grow, protect. Position, grow, protect. I think these are the principles behind making double crop soybean work. If you follow these principles, we will maximize our yield potential for that year and for that field. What I mean by that, let's position that soybean for as long of a growing season as possible. If we do that, we will grow more leaves. There are some techniques that we can use to grow more leaves, but quite honestly, positioning will take care of over half the problem, and most of that comes this time of year, planting, pre-plant, before we even plant the small grain crop in some cases. So, but most of that was going to occur at least before we plant the soybean crop. And then finally, we need to protect that valuable leaf area. I've stressed over and over and over again that if we don't maintain that leaf area, even if we're able to obtain it, we're going to harm ourselves. And some implications, I'll go through some of those in the future and ahead of the presentation. So position the soybean for longer growing seasons so we can get more leaf area, we can get more light interception, not only just obtain that, by that R3 stage, that early pod stage, but maintain that throughout the season, and then that'll lead to greater yield. I'll go back to this graph briefly. You'll notice I don't have a date here because that date varies. Some years it's at the end of May when we get this rapid fall off in yield. Sometimes it'll move into July. That is solely because of what the early season growing season looks like. If this growing season before this rapid drop off, let's just give it a date, June 15th, if we can obtain a leaf area index of 4 and maintain it, then this date may be into July. So that is a key. And I'm going to talk about some things we can do to at least get us there. Now, you do get a small decrease in yield just from planting date earlier. That's because we're putting those critical reproductive stages in shorter days. But that's so minor, very minor. In a rain-fed situation, especially, that matters very little. Matter of fact, I will say that what I found in some of my work is that sometimes a later planting date helps us, especially on some of our droutier soils, because it pushes those critical reproductive stages later in the growing season when we are more likely to have either greater rainfall or less stress on the crop because it's not nearly as hot. Here, we got not only shorter days, but there's just less sunlight intercepted. In other words, we don't have enough leaf area. Okay, let's get into the positioning part. Position the soybean for longer growing season. First one's simple, guys. Grow barley. If you've got a market for it, if you can grow barley, please do that. Our research in the past, 10 years ago, we were trying to basically burn some barley and make ethanol out of it. That venture didn't succeed. But my research at that time, I didn't show any yield decrease from a full season crop. And it looked very good. But again, all of us can't do that. What that allows us to do is get that barley off earlier and then plant soybeans earlier. It's a simple thing. But if we're growing wheat, here's a strategy I advocated a couple of years ago. I'm backing off on this a little bit just because of our wheat crop, but plant an early maturing wheat variety early. Now, early for us in Virginia historically would have been before mid-October. And I think a large part of that, you can go through to Delmarva and see that plant October, at least get it in before the 1st of November. You get into Southern Virginia and we'll talk about, maybe November 1st could be that date. But keep in mind, we can sacrifice, about a bushel of wheat for every day earlier harvest, which will lead to a day earlier planting of soybean. And this is based on 1 bushel of wheat equals a half a bushel of soybean. And I look at price with that. If we got $5 wheat and $10 beans, it works out. Just recently, the wheat prices hadn't been keeping up, or I think they're keeping up now, largely because soybean prices have fallen. So we did a bunch of research several years ago with Carl Griffey, Wade Thomason, and myself, looked at different varieties planted as early as mid-September or late September into early October and late October. That planting date did not help us at all. And in the end, it didn't buy us a lot of time as far as planting soybean, but we did find certain varieties that work best at certain planting dates. I'm not going to get into that. So I've kind of taken that earliness off of this, but plant an early maturing wheat variety. I know they don't yield as well, but keep in mind we can sacrifice a bushel of wheat for every day earlier. And you work that out and it's basically a wash as well. All right, this is what I'm strongly advocating now. Harvest wheat early, up to 20% moisture. Now, got to get that dried down. You don't want to be storing 20% moisture. You don't even want to store it in a truck very long. you got to move it to a dryer very quick, and that's going to, and of course, that's going to need to be a continuous flow dryer. So if you don't have that, this may not be an option. But this is some work we've been doing well, we did research, 5 states, 3 years, throughout the Mid-Atlantic. Started in 2014 with some planting of wheat. We ended that in 2017. We had over 20 site years here. And so what we did, we went in, and this is a plot here in Suffolk, Virginia, and that's where I am with Virginia Tech. I'm in Southeast Virginia. So we started harvesting this at 20% moisture wheat, and then we waited 5 to 7 days and harvested another block, and then we harvested a block after that. And then we came immediately in the same day, planted, let's see, we planted, I think, 6 soybean varieties, 2 within each relative maturity. For us in Virginia and in North Carolina, that would have been a late 4, early 5, late 5. Once we get into Pennsylvania, that turned into maybe an early 3, late 3, and early 4. So that's what we're trying to look at here. And I'm going to show you some of these results. Let's get directly to the wheat results first. I'm going to show you individual state data first. Going from north to south. Pennsylvania, we really didn't see any yield decline, so I'm not going to show it in Pennsylvania. And this is the day of the year. This would be June 1, and this would be July 21st, to give you an example. 180, 179 or so would be about the end of, it'd be about the middle of the year, June 30th or so forth. So keep that in mind as we go through. What I'm going to show is relative yield. We put this on relative yield and not absolute yield because the yield varied with years. So that kind of consolidated that down, normalized the data. This is wheat yield. In Maryland, saw no yield decline really until after June 30th, but then we had a sharp wheat decline in Maryland. Delaware, same type of thing, but notice this date of decline moved earlier. Virginia moved even earlier. Now we're definitely up into that middle of June area. North Carolina, now we're getting a wheat decline almost immediately when we started harvesting. And this, in our case, we had some early wheat harvest in this case. We were able to harvest as early as June 1, but we actually harvested, I think, May 29th and 30th in North Carolina, as well as some sites in Virginia. But the thing you notice is this magic, if you want to call it there, this point where the wheat yield declines gets earlier as we move south. Now, why is that? We looked at test weight, and I'm going to show Pennsylvania data here because even though we didn't see a large yield decline with this, the test weight did go down quite rapidly in Pennsylvania. This is only 2016 and 15 data. But about the end of June is when they could start harvesting their wheat, even at high moisture wheat. There's Maryland, test weight's going down almost immediately. Delaware, hey, same thing. There's Virginia, there's North Carolina. So it really doesn't matter which state we were in. We saw a decline in test weight. That did account for a good part of our yield decline, but not all of it. We also had shattering and so forth happening at that time. But this was a big factor in our test weight decline. Why did we see, and I think, why are we seeing this? Of course, test weight's going to go down with time, but it's rainfall events largely. The more rainfall events we get, the more likely we're going to see test weight and light wheat. We did do some dawn work. None of our locations dropped below the 300 level, but you do see somewhat decline in some places. We just didn't have the fusarium head blight in these years. We did see it in Suffolk and in Maryland a couple of years, but only at very late planting dates. We did take this as well as other quality measurements, but I won't get into those. Let's move on to the soybean. Same study, but I want to show you the soybean yields. Okay, this is a combination of the data from all states. There were state differences, and those were quite large. Most of the North Carolina data and Virginia data is up in this region, and then of course we get into Pennsylvania and northern states. It's down in here, but we actually had some late harvest in Virginia as well due to rainfall. We couldn't get into harvest, so we threw this in as well. But you can see this typical graph: no yield decline, no yield decline until we get to around the middle of June. Starts declining, and then we get that rapid drop off in yield. So planting date is a key here. Let's look at individual data. It's Pennsylvania. Of course, we didn't plant till late. And there's your decline. They were using the earlier maturity groups in this case, but that's it. This is really the only way that I think the growers in this area even found to make double crop work, though, is harvest that wheat at high moisture. Maryland, we actually got a rapid drop off in yield in really all years with various maturity groups. And I'll get into maturity groups a little more in detail later, but in general, the later maturity groups at least had the potential for yielding well. We got better, more leaf area with those. Delaware, rain fed, there's our yield decline. Almost immediately we started seeing that decline. Delaware irrigated. I was a little surprised in this, but like most of the cases where we irrigate soybean, we don't focus on that pre-flowering or pre-pod development irrigation. Mistake, not, it's hard to say. So basically the two Delaware data looks similar because of that leaf area, I think. Virginia, here we're getting more of a plateau, but again, middle of June, we start getting that decline. North Carolina, we actually had a decline in all cases. So anyway, the yield decline is there. I don't need to harp on this over and over. We clearly proved that. I won't get in any more details of this, and there's all the data together. Let me back up. That's all the data together. If you want to view this later, you can look at some of the more details with maturity groups in this where we don't have those separated. There were no maturity group difference. Okay, why is that? I've already told you the answer is because we need to grow leaves there. If we're able to grow leaves, then we can maximize that yield. Well, you're saying, well, prove it to me. All right. We didn't go out and measure leaf area directly. We measured NDVI, the normal difference vegetative index. We have found that that reflects leaf area very well, at least under low leaf area conditions. Without going through a lot of the details of this graph, these are reproductive stages, okay? I don't have a date on here because the reproductive stages occur differently for every maturity group, for every planting date. But basically, look, what I need, what I found is an NDVI of 0.85 and 9 is about where we need to be. So largely these earlier June plantings we got there, but really we couldn't maintain that throughout later stages until we got to those early June plantings. So that was the key. How does that relate to yield? We explained 77% of the variation in the data with this NDVI. And that's related to planting dates. So again, I just want to prove to you what I'm saying about leaf area is correct. This is the key. Get those leaves on there. and maintain it. We've got to maintain the leaves because what I'm showing here is this is season long NDVI. If we just tried to relate NDVI, i.e. leaf area, to double crop soybean at flowering or at pod development, there wasn't as good of a relationship. Only when we looked at that season long leaf area was it important. That has implications in other ways as well. Here's all this data if you want to look at it if you want to look at our NDVI data and try to understand that. And I think we've got this published as a referee journal, but I'm going to put an extension bulletin out on this as well. Drying wheat down, I think the only way we can do this, batch dryers, I don't think it's going to work for 20% moisture wheat. At least that's what growers tell me. This is an investment. Drying cost, I don't know if it's more or less. Really don't have a good estimation on it. But this is something, this is a picture I just took this year. A farmer in Virginia was showing me his new continuous flow dryer. He loves it. He said, I was putting 20% moisture wheat in here, getting my beans planted earlier, and everything's working out. Now he's drying soybean in it. This time he dried corn in it. It's kind of one of those things. It's like when a grower moves from a drill to a 15-inch split row or air drill that's metering the seed out. They'll say they'll never go back because of seed savings and yield increases. But this is what this grower, as well as other growers that's had these dryers, say. He said, I'll never go back to batch drying, even though they still maintain those dryers that they have. He said, this is the way to go. So I really need to put some economics on this and see what the fixed cost of these would be and converting this, because that's the real key to making that program work. Okay, spoke a lot about that because I just showed you about 3/4 of this is due to planting early maturing variety. And then we can go to a later maturing soybean variety. I'll continue to say plant as late of a maturing soybean variety as you can that will guarantee that it will mature before frost in double crop settings. Not always the case in full season, but in double crop settings, yes. The later maturing variety gives you a higher chance of higher yield. I'll go back to these data and let you look at some of these variety differences. This is again NDVI, hence leaf area. The higher this bell-shaped curve is, the better, and the broader it is, the better. The threes just weren't getting there. And this is why the Pennsylvania, northern areas, they just have a tough time getting to this leaf area. And then we get a rapid drop off later. But when we get into later maturing varieties, even though I didn't see in Virginia over any of my years differences from late 4s to early 5s to late 5s in yield, we definitely saw more leaf area with these. If we'd had a drier year or a worse year, the yield scenario would have probably changed. So later planting date, later maturing soybean variety. I'll also say less productive soil, later maturing variety is good too. Take you back to this scenario on the Rappahannock River bottom, Caroline County, I think. Same picture, same date. Here, a later maturing variety would work. And yeah, I recognize we're not changing varieties in a field, but we could between fields. Use a stripper header. Oh, I love these things. This is a photograph I took this year on the field I'm working in. It's easier to plant beans. I get better stands. You move through the field faster with these things, get that wheat out quicker. Now you got to make sure you can dry it quicker, I suppose. And then plant that thing. It's just, I really like the system, but keep in mind, the growers that don't like this that I've run into are the ones that say, I can't afford to slow down during soybean harvest, because eventually you're going to pull this small grain through. Okay, let's go to number 2. Grow more leaves. There's some techniques we can use here, even I don't think this is important as positioning, because positioning is going to allow us to grow the most leaves. Let's get started on this. Okay, fertilize for both crops. I feel like I don't need to emphasize that to at least the folks that are sitting in on this meeting. I think you know that. The one thing I want to emphasize is we are taking a lot of nutrients off of this straw. Mark Ryder published something on this. I was involved with that as well. We collected some of the straw, and especially with potassium, we were removing a lot of potassium off the land. So make sure if you're selling straw, at least you're getting the value of that fertilizer. However, because you may have to make up for it eventually. I'm not saying you will this year, but keep in mind things like nitrogen and potassium, we're recycling that with this straw. A lot of that's going to go straight to the soybean crop and put it back at the top where it needs to be, because we found potassium does leach in our sandier soils. It even leaches in our clay Piedmont soils. I didn't expect that, but we saw the same thing there. I mean, these are low CEC soils. So you're going to get leaching of potassium. It's much slower. It's not nitrogen or sulfur, but it's there. So keep that in mind. The other thing about the small grain residue, it could tie up some nutrients. So I'm saying, if you can leave it. But, once the soil microorganism starts breaking this down, we could tie up some of those nutrients. So years and years ago, I decided, well, let's put a little nitrogen down on soybean at planting, and let's see if that helps us grow. Long story short, it did, and we got a yield bump out of it. Again, this data is nearly 10 years old now, but it's good data. We had 7 locations, looked at different nitrogen rates, soybean yields here on the y-axis. We injected that nitrogen in the middle of 15-inch rows. We injected it just because, with a culture, of course, just so we wouldn't lose any of it for experimental purposes. We got about a 1 bushel yield increase, and I'm not going to show you the leaf area data, but it was because those plants grew a little faster. But now you're saying, yeah, David, I can't pay for the nitrogen with that. You're 100% correct. So this is nothing I'm recommending. Probably the most useful thing about this data is we got a 2 bushel yield decrease when we put 50 pounds on. Now, I'm not saying manure is going to bother you or anything like that because it's slow release, but chemical nitrogen will hurt our beans. We didn't dig roots and look at the rhizobia, but I'm sure that was the reason. We just weren't fixing nitrogen. Is there such thing as a double crop variety? I would say for most varieties, no. Most varieties do well in both situations, but we have run up against a few varieties that do perform better in double crop or late planting. We're now investigating, maybe some bushiness versus thin line varieties, but I haven't seen that to be a big issue. We conduct both double crop and full season tests largely for this. Weeds. Kurt, this is going to slow our growth down more than anything, resistant weeds or just poor weed control. I show this one because, hey, soybean comes out of the ground competing with this, it's not going to grow. So control your weeds, grow more leaves if possible, irrigate. I'm not saying irrigate early, and I know some Delaware has done more work on this than anyone, but under a dry year, we need to get these leaves growing. So I'm just cautioning that we don't have any good data to prove this, but I'm just saying don't always wait till flowering. If you're drought stressed, let's get it taken care of. Narrow rows are important, but we found years ago that drills don't really help us as much as spacing those plants out in, say, 15-inch rows with a metered unit. Higher seeding rates, poor productivity areas are are very important. So, where we have low leaf area, we need to increase our seeding rate. If anybody's interested in variable rate seeding, we're completing a small study this year, and I want to continue to look at that. I think that we're doing this for full season and soybean. I'm just throwing this out. If you're interested, let me know. We're seeing differences in productivity of field, and it's largely related to leaf area on how we need to vary seeding rate. Okay, I need to move on, so I think we have, Kurt, looks like we've got about 15 minutes left, but I'd like to leave some room for questions. Let's protect this valuable leaf area now. Position it, grow it, but let's protect it. Okay, weeds. This has more to do with growth because we're competing with the plant, but Henry Wilson and myself years ago did some work with herbicide injury on double crop beans as well as full season beans. We could burn nearly all the leaves off of the full season beans. And what we're talking about is maybe some of our mixing certain PPO herbicides or something else, even some of our Synchrony products or something like that with our Roundup or Liberty. If we injure the leaf area, if we take away that leaf area, we actually saw a drop in yield. So I'll just caution you on that. Be careful with that type of thing. Don't burn all the leaves off, but control the weeds is the main thing. Defoliators, big difference. Pod and seed feeders we got to manage. We have to manage that based on thresholds. Defoliators, okay, you'll hear 30% of the leaf area, we can lose that much. Well, that's true on full season beans in most cases. I've even seen you could lose nearly half of the leaf area if you got a big full season crop. We can't do that in double crop. I think our thresholds now are down around 10 to 15% for double crop, but just monitor. It's going to vary from year to year. Now, with that said, don't be spraying everything early for defoliators. These are not huge yield robbers, because what I have seen, once you spray those pests, or sometimes you spray these pests too often with the pyrethroid, then this guy comes in, soybean looper, and he will eat your sack lunch quickly. So just be aware of that. Again, I'm not advocating spraying for foliage feeders, but there are some cases where we have actually recommended spraying for fairly low damage in double crop fields. Okay, foliar diseases. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with this. This is Cercospora blight. I call that our nibbler disease. That's the disease that really doesn't show up till late in the season, but it starts early. Not going to get a big yield increase over this. Some years we won't get any. But again, this is taking away leaf area. Now you can't really scout for this at all. This will have to be based on, whether or not the weather's right, whether or not you feel like it's fungicide will be, if those environmental conditions are right, and the model we're working on shows we start monitoring that before flowering, a couple of weeks before flowering, we can kind of predict when to spray, and we've been 90% accurate telling you not to spray. Not nearly as good telling you when to spray, but this can take your yield down a little bit. More concerning would be something like frog eye leaf spot. I think you can scout for this. Once you start seeing those spots, you kind of wonder in full season beans, but in double crop beans, I think we may want to be a little more aggressive with our foliar fungicides. Okay, consider tram lines. I'm talking about protecting the leaf area. Richard Taylor and I did some work years ago, and we showed a 1 to 3% decline depending on the width of the sprayers in 7.5-inch rows from running over R3, R4 beans, and that would be timed with our fungicide spray. That holds up today. That's why I'm considering maybe putting in some tram lines. This is and I do work with some growers that do regularly use tram lines in soybean. This is a traffic. This is a guy in Virginia that's using controlled traffic. He's really experimenting with this, and he's doing a good job, even in the Piedmont, where none of our fields are square. So he's running the same tracks over and over again. So he ran them for herbicide, ran them in, for fungicide and other applications. So, you know, I wondered if he's running them over all year, does it hit yield as hard as it would on those experiments that Richard and I did, where we just ran over R3, R4 beans? Well, we actually went in and harvested this while he was harvesting the field. I took my plot combine in. We harvested a 5-foot width out of there and then went right next to it, harvested a 5-foot width. We got a 5-bushel yield decline just in this area versus this. I guess some of that could be compaction, but if you work that out to a, you know, his 120-foot sprayer, I think he may have a 90-foot sprayer in the Piedmont, but you work that out, it comes right back to that, you know, 1 to 3% yield decline. It comes back, in this case, about a 1 to 2% yield decline. So that's holding true. So consider these tram lines. Nematodes, the previous presentation spoke of that. She gave a, you know, briefly about this. We've got to control these, especially double crop beans. So this is real important. So I'm going to end up there. I think we got some, maybe 10 minutes or so for questions. And I think Kurt will relay those to me. And I think I can even somehow pull up the chat box. But I'll let Kurt relay it because I've lost the chat box. But again, I want to, take home messages: position, grow, and protect. Position those soybeans and extend that growing season as long as possible. Grow more leaves and protect that leaf area after you grow it. So I want to thank all of our grower organizations, as well as the national organization. They continue to fund really good soybean research. That big project I was talking about was funded by these organizations. So thank you very much. I'll leave this up on the screen briefly. Best place to call me is the mobile number, even though you may have heard I got a call in the office today. That's really unusual. So, Kurt, do you have any questions?